Picture the stage at like one of those mega glamorous, super high stakes Silicon Valley industry summits.
Oh, I know exactly the kind you mean. The dramatic lighting, the perfectly curated backdrop.
Exactly. The lighting is perfect.
Yeah.
The auditorium is just packed to the brim with, billionaires, tech journalists, top-tier
It's a
developers.
whole ecosystem, basically.
Right. And the organizers, they've set up what is supposed to be this ultimate historic photo opportunity. So they ask the two most powerful CEOs in artificial intelligence to stand side by side.
Sam Altman of OpenAI and Dario Amodei of Anthropic.
Yes. And the photographer's instructions are, standard corporate theater. Like, stand close, shake hands, maybe do the whole unified, we are building the utopian future together kind of pose.
Which is, it's the kind of forced camaraderie the market absolutely loves, right?
Totally.
It signals stability. It tells all the institutional investors that, hey, despite the literally billions of dollars on the line here, everyone is fundamentally playing nice. We're all gentlemen here.
But according to the sources from this specific event, they flat out refuse.
Wow.
Yeah, they just dead stop on the stage. No handshake, no unified pose, nothing.
Just completely freezing out the photographer.
Literally. And the tension, it wasn't just some mild, awkward hesitation. Our sources say it was radioactive.
That is wild, especially considering their history.
Exactly. These two men used to be incredibly close colleagues. They worked in the exact same lab, and now they are locked in, honestly, probably the most bitter corporate rivalry of this entire century.
Yeah, and that frozen, deeply uncomfortable moment on stage, that's really just a physical manifestation of a massive market flip. A flip that, honestly, almost nobody saw coming.
Which brings us to the actual mission of today's deep dive, because to understand the software that is currently rewriting the global economy for all of you listening, you really have to look right at that exact fracture.
You really do. We're talking about a completely unprecedented shift in market dominance here.
Right, because Anthropic was widely considered a dark horse, right? Like a distant second-place research lab for a long time.
Exactly. They were the quiet ones. But they engineered a turnaround so aggressive that it practically broke all the standard economic models for how software is supposed to scale.
And the numbers we have in the sources are just staggering. Today, we are mapping out exactly how Anthropic managed to multiply its revenue almost 100 times over in roughly 3 years.
Which is just, it's an absurd trajectory.
It really is. And more importantly, we're going to unpack how they managed to challenge and honestly, potentially dethrone OpenAI in the highly lucrative enterprise space by early 2026.
And that fundamentally changes the narrative we've all been sold.
Right, because we're constantly fed this idea that the AI race is just this mad sprint to acquire a billion users, right?
Yeah, the classic, whoever gets their app on every smartphone first is the ultimate winner.
Exactly. But this whole situation reveals something entirely different. It's more like a high-stakes game of chess. And the company that intentionally moved the slowest...
The one that actually put massive friction into its own development cycle.
Yes. The slow one is the one capturing the foundational infrastructure of the entire corporate world. And why should you, the listener, care about this billion-dollar drama? Because this specific battle directly dictates the software that will soon read your emails, analyze your company's data, and maybe even write your code at work.
It's the infrastructure of our daily lives now. And to really get it, you have to look at the standard Silicon Valley playbook, which is entirely built on this concept of the first mover advantage.
Right. The idea that being first is everything.
Exactly. It's almost treated like a law of physics out there. If you launch first, capture the public's mind share, and build those network effects, your momentum basically becomes unassailable.
Like Amazon with e-commerce or Google with search.
Precisely. And OpenAI had the ultimate first mover advantage with ChatGPT. I mean, they reached 100 million users faster than literally any application in human history.
Which is exactly why the current scoreboard, as we sit here in early 2026, feels so incredibly jarring. Because Anthropic isn't just quietly building in the background anymore.
No, they are absolutely going for the throat.
Wow, yeah. During the Super Bowl, they dropped a commercial that was, frankly, a highly personalized, brutal troll aimed directly at OpenAI and Sam Altman.
Oh, the Super Bowl ad. That was a surgical strike.
It really was. So the ad featured a prompt demonstration that if you're just a casual viewer eating nachos, it seemed Totally innocuous.
But for industry insiders, it was a massive flex.
Totally. I actually watched the clip like a dozen times just to catch all the tiny details in the sources.
Oh, yeah.
So it shows a user typing into a generic-looking AI interface, just asking for a quick back workout.
Seems simple enough.
Right. The AI responds, asking to personalize it, requesting their age, weight, and height. And then the user types, 5'7", 23 years old, 140 pounds. Got tri-lip maxing.
Yeah, and that phrase, tri-lip maxing, combined with that highly specific biometric data, is the absolute kill shot.
Wait, unpack that for everyone. Why is that so specific?
So, industry insiders immediately recognized it as a highly targeted reference to Sam Altman's own notoriously public biohacking and optimization habits.
Oh, wow. So they just put his literal routine on a massive screen.
Basically, yeah. I mean, Anthropic didn't spend millions of dollars on a Super Bowl spot to explain how their neural network architecture works. They bought that incredibly expensive ad space to execute a psychological flex.
They're publicly broadcasting like, we see your metrics, we understand your obsession with optimization, and we have out-optimized you.
Exactly. It's a digital shot across the bow. But when you look at the actual data shift, the trolling starts to make perfect sense. They have the financial numbers to back up the arrogance now.
They really do. Let's actually rewind a bit to 2023. Back then, the enterprise AI market.
And just to clarify, we mean the heavy-duty tools integrated into Fortune 500 companies, not just, a teenager asking a chatbot to write a history essay.
Right, the serious B2B corporate contracts. In 2023, that market was completely dominated by OpenAI. They held a 50% market share.
That's the entire market.
Yes. And Anthropic was sitting at a highly marginalized 12%. I mean, the general consensus at the time was that the enterprise war was effectively over before it even really began.
Because the momentum just seemed totally insurmountable. OpenAI had the brand recognition. They had this incredibly aggressive sales force.
But then fast forward to late 2025, Anthropic suddenly surges to a 40% enterprise market share.
And OpenAI drops to 27%.
Which is just a staggering reversal. And the revenue backing this up is where the math just gets completely dizzying.
Yeah, the multipliers are insane.
Anthropic went from making about $100 million in 2023 to $1 billion in 2024. And now they are approaching $10 billion in 2025.
That is a 100x multiplier in roughly 36 months. You just do not see that kind of scaling in hardware or enterprise software.
Never. And the sources cite an Epoch AI analysis from February 2026 projecting that, on this exact trajectory, Anthropic will actually surpass OpenAI as the world's most profitable AI company by mid-2026.
And this is exactly where we have to stop and question the actual mechanics of that growth, because how do you stall a literal freight train like OpenAI?
Right.
You don't do it by just building a slightly better chatbot. You do it by operating on a completely alien set of incentives.
Which means we really have to look at the architect of this whole strategy, the CEO, Dario Amodei, because his foundational background is, well, it's the absolute antithesis of the classic tech founder narrative, isn't it?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
He's not your standard Silicon Valley archetype at all. He wasn't a hacker trying to build a dating app in a Stanford dorm room,
Right. No hoodies and energy drinks while trying to disrupt the pizza delivery market.
Exactly. Dario was actually born in 1983 and raised in San Francisco's Mission District. And the sources make a point to note that back in the 80s and early 90s, the Mission was a very working-class neighborhood.
Yeah, long before it became the wealthy tech hub it is today.
Right. His father was an Italian immigrant who worked as a leather craftsman. His mother is Jewish and managed projects at a local library.
So no generational tech wealth, no venture capital connections sitting around the dinner table.
None at all. And his academic trajectory actively rejected the prevailing trends of his environment, too. Think about his high school years. It's the late 90s.
The dot-com bubble was at its absolute peak in the Bay Area.
Yes. Everyone and their brother was learning HTML to try and cash in on the internet gold rush. But Dario completely ignored it.
He went the total opposite direction. The sources say he actually made the U.S. Physics Olympiad national team at 17.
Which is incredibly difficult to do.
Oh, I can't even imagine. And then he studied physics at Caltech in Stanford and eventually earned a PhD from Princeton.
Yeah.
But here's the crucial part. His PhD wasn't in computer science or software engineering.
It was in biophysics and neuroscience.
And that distinction between being a software engineer versus a biophysicist is so vital to understanding Anthropic's eventual product architecture, isn't it?
It is the skeleton key to their entire philosophy. Because a traditional software engineer views code essentially as a tool to construct a product. You write the logic, you compile the application, you find a few bugs, and you ship it. You iterate later.
Move fast and break things, right?
Exactly. But a biophysicist and a neuroscientist, they look at intelligence, whether it's biological or artificial, as a profoundly complex mathematical phenomenon.
It's not just a product to them.
Right. It's a system that must be modeled, deeply understood, and heavily constrained before it is ever unleashed. They are explicitly trained to look for cascading system failures, not just, a UI glitch or a software bug.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But having a theoretical physics background is really just the baseline of his story. The emotional core of this entire deep dive, the actual catalyst that dictates Anthropic's entire business model today, happened back in 2006.
Yeah, this is where the story gets incredibly personal and tragic.
It really does. In 2006, Dario's father passed away from a highly aggressive cancer called acute myeloid leukemia. And the sources point out that at that specific time, the survival rate for this exact disease was basically a coin toss, around 50%.
And the tragedy of that specific timeline is just agonizing when you look at medical history. Because just a few short years after his father's passing, the medical community achieved this monumental breakthrough in that exact field.
They developed those second-generation targeted therapies, right?
Yes, specifically tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And these drugs were designed for the exact mutation causing that specific cancer his father had.
And the impact of those drugs was unbelievable. Those targeted therapies took the survival rate for acute myeloid leukemia from 50% all the way up to 95%.
It went from a literal coin toss to a near certainty of survival.
Wow, just a few years too late.
Yeah. And when you process that kind of profound loss through the analytical systems-based mind of a biophysicist, the conclusion is devastatingly clear.
He realized his father didn't just die of a disease.
Exactly. He died of a timing error in the velocity of human scientific progress.
That is such a heavy way to look at it.
But it's true. If the engine of medical discovery had been just slightly faster, if we were slightly more efficient at parsing complex biological data and running protein simulations, those second-generation drugs would have cleared clinical trials earlier.
And his father would have lived.
Yes.
That reframes everything about Anthropic for me. Because while all these other tech founders are looking at artificial intelligence as like the ultimate commercial gold rush, a way to serve better ads or replace customer service call centers, Dario views AI as a literal time machine.
That's the perfect analogy. His fundamental motivation is to build a computational engine that can massively accelerate biomedical and scientific research to prevent that specific kind of human tragedy from ever repeating.
He's trying to buy back the time his father ran out of.
Precisely. And the downstream effects of that very personal motivation completely dictate how the engineering is done.
How so?
Well, think about it. If your ultimate overarching goal is to cure cancer or synthesize entirely novel chemical compounds, your absolute highest priority has to be precision.
Right, because the stakes are literally life and death.
Exactly. You simply cannot tolerate a neural network that occasionally hallucinates fake medical data or outputs structurally unsound chemical formulas just because management wanted to rush a product to market to appease investors.
So the technology must be rigorously, almost mathematically safe and perfectly aligned before it even takes a single action.
It's non-negotiable for him.
It's a really heavy realization for us as users, too. Like you, listener, think about the software tools we are starting to use every single day to draft emails or analyze spreadsheets. They carry the ghosts of their creators. This deep personal grief fundamentally rewrote the very DNA of the artificial intelligence that Anthropic is deploying right now.
It really did. But here is the major friction point. Having an uncompromising philosophy of safety is incredibly difficult to sustain in a hyper-capitalistic environment.
Oh yeah, Silicon Valley rewards speed above literally all else.
Right, and that rigid adherence to safety and precision is exactly what put Dario on a direct, unavoidable collision course with Sam Altman and the leadership at OpenAI.
So let's trace that collision, because Dario was actually at the epicenter of OpenAI's creation, wasn't he?
Oh, he was foundational. There was this now legendary dinner back in the summer of 2015 at the Rosewood Hotel on Sand Hill Road.
The famous Rosewood dinner.
Yeah. Elon Musk, Sam Altman, and a hand-picked group of the absolute top AI researchers on the planet gathered there. And Dario was one of them.
And the explicit goal of that dinner was to create a nonprofit entity, right? dedicated to building artificial general intelligence, or AGI, safely away from the immediate commercial pressures of a place like, say, Google.
That was the original charter.
Yeah.
And Dario was absolute core leadership there from the beginning. He was instrumental in building GPT-2 and GPT-3.
Which are the massive foundational models that basically prove that scaling up large language models actually produced emergent reasoning capabilities in the first place.
Exactly. He proved the scaling laws. But his most vital contribution, the thing that actually makes consumer AI even possible to use today, was his team's development of something called RLHF.
Okay, let's unpack RLHS because the sources mention it a lot. What exactly is it?
It stands for Reinforcement Learning from Human Feedback. And without RLHF, a product like ChatGPT would be completely and utterly unusable by the general public.
Really? Why?
Because a raw language model, one that's just been pre-trained on the entire open internet, is essentially a chaotic autocomplete engine.
Just guessing the next word.
Right. It mathematically predicts the next word based on its training data. And because the internet is absolutely filled to the brim with toxicity, bias, and incredibly dangerous information, a raw model will readily output hate speech or give you detailed instructions for building explosives if you just prompt it the right way.
Wow. Okay, so I've always wondered about the actual mechanics of fixing that. I know RLHF, quote unquote, tames the model, but how do they actually execute it? Because you can't just manually reprogram a neural network with billions of parameters, right?
No, you can't go in and edit the code like a traditional software bug. It's a multi-stage behavior shaping process.
Okay, walk me through it.
First, human raters are given a bunch of prompts and several different responses generated by the raw, untamed AI. The humans then rank those responses based on things like helpfulness, politeness, and most importantly, safety.
So it's basically humans grading the AI's homework.
Exactly. Then, this massive human-ranked dataset is used to train a second, completely separate AI model. This one is called a reward model.
Okay, a reward model.
And this reward model's only job is to learn to perfectly mimic human preference. Once that reward model is trained, you finally unleash the original AI, but you attach the reward model to it.
Like an overseer.
Exactly like an overseer. So every single time the primary AI generates a response during its training phase, the reward model scores it. If the primary AI tries to output something toxic or dangerous, the reward model heavily penalizes it.
So through thousands and thousands of iterations, the primary AI essentially learns to behave nicely just to maximize its reward score.
You got it. It's classical operant conditioning, just applied to a massive mathematical matrix.
So Dario's team literally built the steering wheel and the brakes for the entire generative AI industry.
They did. He mathematically proved that you could align these massive, chaotic models to human values.
But the sources make it clear that building the brakes wasn't the actual problem at OpenAI. The rift that fractured the whole company came down to when and exactly how you deploy the vehicle itself.
Yeah, the fundamental disagreement was purely on deployment strategy. And the sources provide a highly illuminating analogy for this philosophical divide.
The new drug analogy.
Right. Imagine a pharmaceutical lab synthesizes a new compound with incredible world-changing potential. But the human clinical trials are only partially complete. We don't know all the side effects yet.
Okay.
Sam Altman's approach, which quickly became the prevailing OpenAI strategy, was akin to releasing that drug to the public immediately.
Just putting it in pharmacies right away.
Yeah. Because the standard software engineering mindset dictates that the absolute best way to find edge cases and bugs is through massive real-world deployment. You get it into the hands of millions of people, you gather the adverse effect data in real time, and you just patch the model on the fly.
It's iterative beta testing, but on a global societal scale.
Exactly. But Dario's approach, deeply informed by his medical and scientific lens, found that strategy completely unacceptable.
I can imagine.
You do not release a highly potent, poorly understood compound into the general population just to see what happens. You isolate it. You run exhaustive, double-blind phase 3 clinical trials. You bring in red teams to try and break it in a secure environment.
And you only release it when you have a mathematical certainty of its safety boundaries.
Right. Even if conducting those massive trials takes months and months and actively allows a competitor to capture the initial market share, safety trumps speed.
Well, that is an irreconcilable difference. You physically cannot beta test and clinical trial the exact same product at the same time.
You can't. And by late 2020, that internal tension reached a breaking point. Dario felt the safety mandates he helped design were being systematically compromised for commercial speed and hype.
So he leaves. But the sources highlight that this wasn't just a disgruntled CEO stepping down. He executed what the industry now refers to as the Great Exodus.
It was a massive brain drain.
Yeah.
He walked out with his sister, Daniela Amodei, and 5 other incredibly close friends and elite researchers.
Many of whom he had worked with previously at Google Brain, right?
Yeah. 7 irreplaceable people. The core architects who literally held the fundamental logic of the models in their heads. They all just walked out the door simultaneously.
Okay, but here's where I have to push back a bit, or at least look at it from the investor's point of view. From a pure business perspective, taking your top talent and intentionally starting a company with an explicit mandate to move slower than the competition sounds like absolute corporate suicide.
It sounds crazy to a VC, yes.
Yeah. Right. How do you walk into a venture capital firm on Sand Hill Road and say, hey, we want billions of dollars in compute power, but we are going to intentionally delay our product launches to run safety tests, actively allowing our rivals to beat us to market. VCs want hypergrowth. They don't want hypercaution.
They absolutely don't.
Yeah.
And that is why it requires an incredibly specific type of corporate architecture to survive that kind of deliberate friction.
Because the pressure to monetize would eventually crush them.
Exactly. You can have all the shared moral conviction in the world as founders, but if the legal and structural foundation of your company demands rapid commercialization, the founders will eventually be forced to compromise. Or the board will simply replace them with someone who will.
Which brings us to arguably the most unsung but critical figure in this entire narrative. The person who actually built the fortress that allowed Dario's philosophy to survive the brutal realities of capitalism.
Daniela Amodei.
Yes. Because in an industry that endlessly lionizes the technical founder, the coder who stays up till 4 a.m. writing the algorithm, Daniela provided the structural and psychological scaffolding that allowed that technical brilliance to function without cannibalizing itself.
She really did. So Anthropic was incorporated in 2021, and Daniela helped orchestrate a legal structure that venture capitalists traditionally despise.
What did she do?
First, the 7 founders split the equity almost completely evenly.
Wow. Equal equity splits among a team that large are notorious for causing paralyzing gridlock, aren't they?
Oh, investors usually hate it. They demand a clear, single visionary with a dominant controlling stake. That way, when hard, deeply unpopular decisions need to be made, someone has the absolute authority to just execute them and end the debate.
But they did it anyway. And the real masterstroke, according to the sources, was their corporate designation. They didn't register Anthropic as a standard C corporation.
Right. They registered as a public benefit corporation, or a PBC.
And this isn't just a nice PR label to put on your website or some obscure tax loophole, is it?
No, it is a profound legal shield that is built directly into Delaware corporate law.
Explain how that works, because fiduciary duty is a huge deal here.
Okay, so in a traditional C corporation, the board of directors and the CEO have a strict, legally binding fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value. Full stop.
Making money is the legal mandate.
Right. So if a CEO intentionally delays the release of a highly anticipated product that could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, purely based on some abstract internal safety concern, the shareholders actually have grounds to sue the leadership for breach of that fiduciary duty.
Because the CEO isn't prioritizing profits.
Exactly.
Right.
The law literally mandates profit optimization. But by structuring as a PBC, Anthropic legally embedded their safety mission, their specific public benefit, directly into the company's foundational charter.
Oh, that is brilliant.
It fundamentally alters the legal fiduciary equation. If Dario decides to pause the deployment of a new Claude model for 6 months just to run adversarial red teaming tests, actively burning cash and losing market ground to OpenAI, the investors cannot legally sue him.
Because the PBC structure legally elevates the safety philosophy to be equal to or even greater than the profit motive.
She literally built a legal moat around her brother's conscience.
That is incredible. And to understand how she even foresaw the need for this kind of intense structural protection, you really have to look at her professional background, because she wasn't a biophysicist like Dario.
No, she was actually an English literature major.
Which is such a perfect counterweight to the hard math guys. But her real practical education in intense corporate dynamics happened back in 2013, right?
Yes, when she became employee number 5 at a payment startup called Stripe.
And today, Stripe is basically the financial backbone of the entire internet.
But back then, it was just a tiny room of developers. And over 5 years, Daniela watched Stripe scale from just a handful of people to thousands of employees.
And experiencing that kind of hypergrowth firsthand is incredibly rare.
It is. She witnessed exactly how the sheer friction of scaling breaks companies. She saw how communication silos form out of nowhere, how early cultural alignment degrades the second your headcount explodes, and how unchecked internal politics can completely paralyze product development.
She saw all the failure states of a tech company.
Exactly. And she took all those lessons and engineered the human operating system of Anthropic. She instituted this ruthless, totally uncompromising hiring philosophy, the no brilliant jerks rule.
I love that rule. But the sources note this represents a radical departure from standard Silicon Valley hiring practices.
It really does. Because the traditional logic dictates that if you find a 10x engineer,
Meaning a true generational coding genius who can solve mathematical bottlenecks that literally no one else can.
right, if you find one of them, you hire them immediately. Even if they are incredibly toxic, deeply arrogant, or totally destructive to team morale.
Because the company thinks their code is just too valuable.
Yeah, the company will simply build an entire HR apparatus around that one person just to manage the collateral damage, because their technical output is deemed indispensable.
But Daniela rejected that entirely.
Completely.
Yeah.
At Anthropic, the technical interview is actually secondary to the behavioral alignment interview.
Real?
Yes, it does not matter if you are the single most brilliant machine learning researcher on the planet. If you demonstrate ego, a lack of collaborative humility, or any misalignment with the safety-first mandate, you fail the interview.
Oh, wow. They will intentionally pass on world-class technical talent just to protect the psychological safety of the team.
Yes, because it's a profound operational realization on her part. One toxic genius can poison the productivity of an entire division. The time and energy management spends managing a brilliant jerk vastly outweighs their individual code contributions.
So Daniela essentially installed herself as the bouncer at the most exclusive high-stakes nightclub in the tech world.
That's exactly what she did. She isn't checking how expensive your shoes are or how elegant your Python script is. She is checking your emotional stability. She's screening for people who won't start a bar fight when the pressure of a massive product launch hits.
And if we look at the results of that filtering process by early 2026, the contrast with their competitors is just astonishing. Look at Elon Musk's company, xAI. The sources note that within a very short window, xAI lost half of its entire founding team.
Yeah, their chief financial officer quit after exactly 102 days.
Which is insane. A CFO abandoning a hyper-funded AI startup after 3 months is a massive klaxon horn signaling major internal dysfunction.
Oh, definitely. And then look at OpenAI.
Yeah.
Of the original 11 founding members, almost all of them are gone.
Right. Elon Musk left and subsequently sued the company. Ilya Sutskever, their brilliant chief scientist, left after participating in that chaotic, globally publicized, and ultimately failed boardroom coup against Sam Altman.
Legends like Andres Karpathy just walked away. It is a constant, exhausting, revolving door of high-drama exits and internal power struggles over there.
Compare that directly to Anthropic. 5 years after that initial 2020 exodus from OpenAI, all 7 original founders are still sitting at the same table.
They survived the agonizing pressure cooker of building a $100 billion valuation company without fracturing. The human operating system that Daniela designed completely held the company together.
Okay, so they have the ironclad stability, they have the legal fortress of the PBC, and they have the uncompromising safety mandate.
Right.
But a legal fortress doesn't generate revenue. Moving slow and being exceptionally safe is great for the soul, but how did that specific philosophy actually translate into $10 billion?
Yeah.
Because it turns out safety wasn't a commercial handicap at all. It was actually the ultimate Trojan horse designed to breach the most lucrative market on Earth.
This is exactly where the strategic brilliance of the Amoti siblings finally snaps into focus for the rest of the world. They didn't just passively hold on to their moral principles, they weaponized them for a very specific, highly lucrative market segment.
Yes, because from day one, Anthropic practically ignored the consumer market. OpenAI was out there fighting this massive, incredibly expensive war to put ChatGPT in front of every high school student, freelance writer, and casual internet user.
They wanted to be the new Google search.
Exactly. But Anthropic looked right past the consumers and stared directly at the corporate enterprise world.
Because they understood a fundamental, immutable truth about Fortune 500 companies. At the highest levels of global business, safety is just another word for risk mitigation.
And massive corporations are entirely driven by minimizing legal and operational risk.
Completely. Think about the actual use cases here. A global investment bank cannot deploy an AI that has even a fractional chance of hallucinating and leaking confidential client financial data into a public chat interface.
That would be a catastrophic lawsuit.
Right. And a pharmaceutical giant cannot use a language model to analyze clinical trial data if the model occasionally just invents fake chemical compounds to please the user.
Or insurance companies, right? They are bound by incredibly strict European and international compliance laws. Every automated decision has to be traceable, explainable, and fundamentally sound.
Exactly. If an artificial intelligence tool cannot mathematically guarantee those specific thresholds of security, data isolation, and reliability, it won't even make it past a corporate IT department's preliminary security audit.
So OpenAI's whole move fast and break things philosophy, while it was fantastic for generating viral Twitter threads and media hype, absolutely terrified corporate compliance officers.
It kept them up at night, but Anthropic anticipated this perfectly. They built constitutional AI, full traceability, and extreme low hallucination guardrails into the bedrock architecture of their Claude models.
It wasn't just a compliance patch bolted onto the software as an afterthought.
No, it was the core engineering premise from day one. And the client roster they secured using this approach is staggering.
Yeah, the sources list some massive names. Allianz, the insurance conglomerate with 500,000 employees, IBM, Pfizer, and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund.
And that fund operates under some of the most draconian investment compliance rules on the planet. These are slow-moving, deeply conservative entities that require agonizingly thorough vetting processes. Anthropic won them over because they spoke the language of enterprise risk fluently.
But safety was really just the baseline, right? It got them through the door and past the IT audits. What actually caused that massive revenue explosion in 2025 was a specific product launch that fundamentally altered what AI could do inside a corporate environment.
May 2025.
Yes.
The launch of Claude Code.
Yes, Claude Code. The sources emphasize that this represents a massive paradigm shift in human-computer interaction. It moved AI from just an advisory role, a chat box, to an actual execution role.
It did. And we really need to break down exactly why this was such a superweapon. Claude Code isn't just a smart assistant sitting in a window spitting out snippets of Python that a human developer then has to copy, paste, run, and debug manually. The sources describe it as operating with the true autonomy of a senior software engineer. There are three critical capabilities here that make it unique. First, closed-loop ability.
Okay, how does a neural network actually execute a closed loop?
Well, closed-loop execution is basically the holy grail of automation. Instead of just predicting text, the model is given direct access to a local terminal environment.
So it can actually execute commands.
Exactly. You give it a high-level command like build a secure user authentication portal. Claude Code writes the necessary logic, but then it actually opens the terminal, runs the deployment scripts, and initiates the testing protocols itself.
And when the test inevitably fails. Because code always breaks on the first run, right?
Always. And that's where the loop actually closes. When the terminal spits back a massive red error trace, the underlying agent captures that error text, feeds it back into Claude's context window, and prompts it to analyze the failure.
So Claude reads its own error.
Yes. It identifies the flaw in its own code, writes a patch, and runs the terminal test again. It loops this entire debugging process autonomously, without any human intervention, until all the tests pass and the software compiles perfectly.
That is wild. But to fix complex software, you have to understand the whole system, not just one file. Which brings us to the second capability, massive code-based navigation.
Right, because most consumer AI models are decent if you feed them a single file, maybe a few hundred lines of code. But an enterprise application like a major bank's mobile app is tens of thousands of lines of code spread across hundreds of deeply interconnected files and directories.
It's a massive web.
It is. So to solve this, Anthropic had to pioneer advanced retrieval augmented generation and massive context windows. Claude Code can autonomously traverse a massive corporate repository. It can trace exactly how a variable defined in file A impacts an obscure function buried way down in file Z.
So it maintains the architectural context of the entire system while it edits a single line.
Exactly. Which leads to the third capability. And honestly, this ties directly back to Dario's foundational obsession with scientific precision. Exceptionally low hallucination rates.
This is the part that blows my mind the most. Because when earlier models didn't know how to use a specific, obscure software library, they would confidently invent a fake command that looked totally plausible.
Which was an absolute nightmare for developers to debug.
Right. But Claude Code is trained with a heavily calibrated confidence threshold.
Yes. When it encounters an obscure library or a proprietary internal API it doesn't understand, the neural network essentially flags its own lack of knowledge.
It knows what it doesn't know.
Exactly. Instead of predicting a fake syntax, it halts the coding process, queries the internet or the internal company intranet, retrieves the official documentation, reads it, and then applies the correct verified syntax.
It literally pauses to read the manual.
It does, and the industry reaction to this specific capability was explosive. The sources highlight this amazing quote from a lead engineer on Google's own Gemini API team.
Oh, I love this part.
This engineer publicly admitted that Claude Code was able to autonomously build a complex architectural design in exactly 1 hour that had taken Google's internal engineering team an entire year to develop.
Having a lead engineer at your biggest rival publicly admit your tool provides an order of magnitude leap in productivity is just an astonishing validation.
It really is. Even Andres Karpathy, the legendary founding member of OpenAI we mentioned earlier, openly stated that Claude is his absolute go-to tool for writing code now.
And the sources even note that Anthropic's own developers admit that a significant portion of the underlying code for the Claude platform is now being written by Claude.
The compounding effect there is critical to understand. If an artificial intelligence is capable of autonomously writing the code to optimize its own underlying infrastructure, the rate of technological acceleration becomes exponential.
But I have to push back here because this sounds honestly terrifying to a lot of people. If Claude Code has closed-loop terminal access and it can rewrite massive architectural repositories, what stops an infinite loop of garbage code?
That is a very valid fear.
Right. What stops a developer from handing over the keys to the entire corporate code base and letting the AI accidentally delete the production database? Like, is this the ultimate liberation from drudge work, or is it a catastrophic security risk?
Well, that exact anxiety is what paralyzes enterprise clients. And that is exactly why Anthropic won the market.
How so?
Because their entire corporate history, the PBC structure, the agonizingly slow deployment cycles, the militant focus on alignment and low hallucination, all of it was purpose-built to alleviate that specific terror.
Oh, I see.
They went to the banks and said, yes, handing over terminal access to an AI is terrifying. Unless that AI was built by the one company that sacrificed billions in consumer revenue specifically to ensure those keys are used safely.
They transformed their perceived weakness into the ultimate enterprise selling point.
They built trust.
Yeah.
And that trust completely inverted the economics of the AI industry. It proved that capturing the most casual users and generating the most media hype doesn't translate into making the most money.
Which brings us to the math of winning. Let's look at the divergent business models that explain how Anthropic captured that massive $10 billion run rate.
The revenue divide between OpenAI and Anthropic is basically a masterclass in the economics of market segmentation.
According to the data in the sources, OpenAI derives roughly 85% of its revenue from individual consumers. These are people paying about $20 a month for ChatGPT+.
Right. You have millions of people using it to draft emails, write cover letters, or help their kids with algebra homework.
But it is a massive volume, incredibly high compute, low margin business model. Serving millions of casual queries requires staggering server infrastructure.
It's incredibly expensive to run. Conversely, Anthropic derives 80% of its revenue from enterprise clients and API usage. And the fundamental unit economics are vastly different.
The sources say their average paying user contributes $211 a month. That is over 8 times higher than OpenAI's average consumer.
And this discrepancy is entirely driven by the perceived value of the tool and the psychology of the buyer.
Exactly. When a consumer uses ChatGPT, they fundamentally view it as a superpowered search engine. They use it like an advanced version of Google.
Right. And human psychology, trained by 2 decades of the internet, dictates that search engines should be free.
So asking a casual user to pay $20 a month feels like a luxury expense. The second they don't have an immediate use for it, they cancel the subscription to save money.
But an enterprise chief technology officer looks at Claude Code and does not see a search engine at all.
What do they see?
They see a direct replacement, or at least a massive multiplier, for a senior software engineer who costs the company upwards of $500,000 to $1 million a year in salary, equity, benefits, and office overhead.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the math changes completely. If an AI tool makes an entire engineering division 50% more efficient, allowing a company to ship products in half the time, a few $100s or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in API compute fees a month isn't viewed as an expense.
It is a massive cost-saving measure. To a Fortune 500 company, Anthropic's fees look like a rounding error on the balance sheet compared to payroll.
And this introduces the concept of structural stickiness, right? In the consumer market, brand loyalty is practically non-existent. A user might pay for ChatGPT in March, switch to Google Gemini in April because of a cool new voice feature, and try Claude in May.
Because the switching cost is literally zero. You just type a different URL into your browser.
But enterprise loyalty is ironclad. Think about the integration process for a company like Allianz. They spend 6 months and millions of dollars in consulting and integration fees, embedding Claude into their secure underwriting systems.
They retrain their staff, they pass brutal regulatory compliance audits.
Once that architecture is set, they are not ripping it out and switching to a competitor next quarter just because OpenAI released a model that scores 2 points higher on some benchmark test.
No way. The switching costs are astronomically high. They are locked in for years.
This strategy created what the sources call a quiet moat. While OpenAI was fighting this loud, highly visible, incredibly expensive war for consumer attention, trying to hit 1 billion users and burning billions of dollars in compute costs serving free users, Anthropic was quietly securing long-term, highly predictable, high-margin contracts with the wealthiest entities on Earth.
And the final tally is a brutal reality check for the move fast crowd. In 2 years, Anthropic's enterprise client base exploded from under 1,000 to over 300,000.
They captured 40% of the high. I was trying to find a good analogy for this while reading the sources, and it feels like this. OpenAI built the world's most spectacular amusement park. Millions of people visit every day, it's flashy, the roller coasters are incredible, and it's constantly dominating the news cycle.
Okay, I like this.
But Anthropic built the power grid that runs the city. The amusement park gets all the tourists and the hype, but the power grid gets a massive, non-negotiable check every single month without fail from every single business in the city because you simply cannot operate without them.
That is spot on. And once a city is wired to a specific power grid, the infrastructure is too deeply embedded and too critical to daily operations to ever easily rip out and replace.
So to bring this massive journey together for you listening, we have mapped a rivalry that is actively shaping the digital infrastructure of the next century. It's incredible to think that this all started not in a boardroom, but with a deeply personal tragedy that instilled a biophysicist with a profound respect for the fragility of human life and an obsessive urgency for safe, precise scientific acceleration.
And that singular philosophy made the compromises of a standard Silicon Valley hypergrowth model completely intolerable, leading to a massive talent exodus from the most heavily funded AI lab in the world.
That exodus necessitated the creation of an entirely new kind of corporate fortress, engineered by a former English major who understood from firsthand experience that psychological stability and cultural alignment were vastly more important to long-term survival than raw, unchecked technical genius.
And that stability, that unyielding, legally mandated focus on safety and reliability became the ultimate Trojan horse. It allowed a quiet, methodical, intentionally slow-moving startup to bypass the reigning champion and quietly dominate the most lucrative, risk-averse sector of the global economy.
To really encapsulate this entire saga, there is a brilliant quote in the sources from Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google and an early investor in Anthropic. He noted that in the very beginning, when Anthropic was just a handful of people who had walked out of OpenAI, they had absolutely nothing.
Right, they had no product, no users, no revenue, and no real benchmark data to show.
So the obvious question is, why did some of the smartest money in Silicon Valley back them? Eric Schmidt said that investors were purely betting on Dario, the person.
In a market that traditionally bets entirely on velocity and hype, the smart money was placing a massive wager on the character, the stability, and the moral conviction of the founders.
The market bets on speed. Investors bet on people, and Dario is betting everything on building a safe, aligned intelligence that could have accelerated science fast enough to save his dad. It is a profoundly, painfully human story that is driving the most advanced, non-human technology we have ever engineered.
It really is.
And as someone listening to this deep dive, this matters to you directly. This behind-the-scenes war is actively shaping the exact software tools you will be mandated to use at your job in the coming years. Safety wasn't a marketing gimmick. It was the ultimate business strategy that won the enterprise war.
The autonomous agents that will soon be managing your workflows, auditing your data, and writing your company's code will carry the specific DNA and constraints of this exact philosophy.
Which leaves me with one final, slightly terrifying thought for you to mull over. We talked extensively about how Claude Code is currently writing its own code base, autonomously making itself smarter and more efficient.
Yeah.
And we discussed how major enterprise companies are locking this AI deeply into their foundational systems on multi-year contracts, allowing it to optimize their daily workflows. Well, what happens when an AI, which is already operating with the capabilities of a senior engineer, decides it knows how to optimize the company's core business model better than the CEO who actually authorized the purchase?
That's a scary thought.
As these tools transition from being mere advisors to being fully autonomous closed-loop executors, are we just buying software anymore? Or are corporations essentially onboarding their future board members?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question that every enterprise client will eventually have to answer.
Something to think about the next time you open a chat window and ask it to do your work for you.